The aim of all sciences is to discover truths. The aim of logic is to discover the laws of truth. One of the many definitions of logic is as the study of the principles of correct reasoning. Therefore, logic is said to be invincible because in order to fight logic, it is necessary to use logic. Every time we are speaking to or discussing with other people, we are negotiating. One of the good and easier ways to get what we want is to build powerful arguments based on serious and formal logic. Learning about logic will not turn us into philosophers overnight, but it will help us become more persuasive. A persuasive person is someone people will listen to because his or her arguments make a lot of sense. Especially in a serious negotiation, you really want to avoid making an error of reasoning known as logical fallacies that will either weaken your arguments or undermine them completely. Formal logic also helps us identify patterns of good reasoning and patterns of bad reasoning, so we know which to follow and which to avoid. With regards to negotiating with logic, we have two fundamental problems we will first need to understand and overcome. The first problem with logic is that we all have our own logic. Yes, we are all different and we all have different points of views, different opinions, which is a good thing. A seller will have plenty of logical reasons why we should pay a high price for his or her product. We, on the other hand, will also have plenty of logical reasons why we want to pay less for that product. So, the main challenge in using logic in negotiations will be to understand how to get the other person or party to agree to our logic and to throw away their very own logic. The second problem with logic is that if we use only logic to either make decisions or negotiate, it will not always lead to the best decisions nor to a good negotiation outcome. This is because the best decisions we make must include considerations from our emotions. For example, using logic alone to decide who we marry, or where we go on holidays, or what car we buy implies we did not consider joy, satisfaction, fulfillment, and happiness into that decision. Emotional attachments is everything, if not the only thing we all have in common as people. And people will buy our ideas, our goods, our services based on their emotions, then try to justify it with logic, preferably with our logic. When we negotiate, we should never forget that negotiation is first of all an information gathering process. We need to take the time not only to understand the interests and positions of the other person, but also to see the things from his or her perspective. Indeed, the best way to persuade people is by listening to them. We need to listen first so we can understand how to best construct our logical arguments in the best way, that these arguments also speak emotionally to the other person. Otherwise, we will start to negotiate against ourselves. This makes listening the most important part of a negotiation, whether we use logic or not. To use logic in a negotiation, we need to understand both logical reasoning and the laws of logic. Practically, we could say that logic is simply the analysis and appraisals of arguments, and a logical argument, which is what we want to make, is constructed by applying one of the three forms of the different types of logical reasoning. The first type of logical reasoning is deductive reasoning, or deductive logic, which is a process of reasoning from one or more evidences from a large set to reach a logically but certain conclusion. In deductive reasoning, If our evidences or statements are true, then the conclusion must be true. For example, if we combine the information or evidences from both statements, all men drink water, and Mr. John is a man, we can make the easy and irrefutable conclusion that Mr. John must drink water. No one can argue against a conclusion made using deductive reasoning. The second type of logical reasoning is inductive reasoning, which is a method of reasoning in which the statements are viewed as supplying some evidence for the truth of the conclusion. Inductive reasoning uses specific evidences to form a larger, generalized conclusion, which is the opposite to deductive reasoning. For example, if you pick a sample of 4 balls from a big basket of 100 balls and find that 3 balls are black and 1 ball is green, a good inductive generalization would be that there are 75% black balls and 25% green balls in the basket. So here, we are making a conclusion based on a probability that may be true and also may be false. The third type of logical reasoning is abductive reasoning, which is more or less best guessing. It normally starts with an observation or a set of observations and then seeks to find the simplest and most likely explanation for the observation. Abductive reasoning allows us to make a conclusion with our interpretations rather than with real evidence. A more elegant explanation is provided by Sherlock Holmes himself. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Another example of abductive reasoning. John has a motorcycle, loves smooth straight roads and riding fast. John dislikes car drivers. Peter has a motorcycle, loves smooth straight roads and riding fast. Based on the observation of John, one could also conclude that Peter also dislikes car drivers. So you see how we could make up a conclusion that, although we cannot verify, could be considered our best guess and very likely. You can also see how easy a cliché can be created. At first glance, abductive reasoning might not feel like the best way to make a conclusion or to build an argument. However, in real life, we hardly ever have all the evidences or information we need. This is why when you visit a medical doctor, he or she is first using abductive reasoning to diagnose your illness before deciding if more tests are needed. Also today, the fields of criminal law, computer science, and research relating to artificial intelligence rely heavily on abductive reasoning. Even linguists uses it to study natural languages, and modern-day philosophers when dealing with really complicated problems. Now that we understand the 3 different types of logical reasoning, we should be in a position to create bulletproof or weatherproof or waterproof arguments in any negotiation, depending on the evidences or information we have at our disposal. Certainly, if our evidence is not specific enough to make a generalized conclusion, we should not make arguments based on deductive reasoning, but rather look in the direction of inductive or abductive reasoning, where probability plays a bigger role. The next step is to learn how to either undermine or dilute the arguments of the other person, or make counter-arguments, which is the other 50% of any negotiation. To do this, we need to understand the laws of logic. Aristotle believed that the laws of logic are necessary conditions for rational thinking to occur, which is why sometimes they are also known as the laws of thought. There are arguably 4 laws of logic. The first law of logic is the law of identity, which insists that every statement must be unambiguous. Every statement must have only one interpretation. For example, the statement, that Mr. John watched a movie at the cinema yesterday is open to more than one interpretation. Yes, John may have been in the cinema, but maybe he was reading a book, not watching the movie. The law of identity essentially means that everything is itself and it cannot be something else. Snow cannot be clouds and water cannot be a tree. So we need to watch out for such deliberate logical errors, also known as sophism, used by the other person. Sophism is a clever but false argument, especially one used deliberately to deceive. Also, when someone uses a fact in an argument to make their point, even though they know the point is false. As an example, listen to this argument. Every man is a person. A woman is not a man. Therefore, a woman is not a person, which is a very false conclusion. Sophism is often where logic gets abused. Today, some salesmen, lawyers, and many politicians can be said to practice sophism for obvious reasons. Also, what needs clarification during a negotiation are logical fallacies, which are notorious offenders to the law of identity. A logical fallacy is when reason is said to fail us. Example, if a certain Mr. John says he broke his arm in 2 places, does he mean 2 locations, as in London and Paris, or that he had a double bone fracture? The second law of logic is the law of non-contradiction, which insists that a statement cannot be true and false at the same time. For example, it cannot be raining and not raining at the same time. Interesting to mention here is that the law of contradiction is what gives rise to paradoxes. A paradox is a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement in logic that superficially cannot be true but also cannot be false. A famous paradox is called the liar's paradox, which states, "This sentence is a lie." If the sentence is true, then it is a lie which is contradictory. The third law of logic is the law of exclusion or of excluded middle, which states that each and everything either is or is not. For example, a lion is either a lion or not a lion. When the subject is a lion, it cannot be something else, like a book or a tree. Interesting to mention here is that the laws of non-contradiction and exclusion are the foundation on which modern mathematics is built. The fourth law of logic is the law of sufficient reason or rational inference, which states that there should be sufficient reason for everything that happens. It means that a statement can be considered true if there is a good enough reason that explains it. For instance, if the ground is wet, it must be due to fluid coming into contact with it. And especially if an offer sounds too good to be true, if there is no logical reason that explains it, it is most likely a trap. Just run away as fast as you can. Good to know, the law of sufficient reason is the basis for the legal principle, presumption of innocence, which is the legal right that every person in a court of law is considered innocent until proven guilty. Logic is a very powerful tool if used correctly. Logic simply is a description of everything that is and everything that is possible. It is impossible to think or imagine something where logic does not apply. Contrary to what any skeptics might say, there is no contradiction in logic, even when we agree that we will never be able to know, understand, or prove everything. Skilled negotiators only really build 1 or 2 powerful and effective arguments, because the more reasons we provide, the more we dilute our main argument. So remember, less is more when building arguments. And we should also remember to be honest with ourselves. Some agreements will be too expensive for us to accept. In that case, we should only offer the best we can do, then allow them to walk away. Whatever you do, may it make you happy.